Greetings, Jets fans. Camp is finally coming. Fall is just around the corner, and the Jets are getting ready for next season. Should we be excited? Are we hyped about the youth movement? Let's chat on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, focusing a bit on the upcoming camp. I also want to talk about a couple of prospects and stuff that I would sort of like to keep an eye on throughout the season, maybe track how they're doing. We have a very interesting selection of players this year at both the NHL level and the AHL level and throughout. And I think in the pro systems, there's a couple of guys who, for me, are sort of on that borderline, right? Players who at some point could crack into Winnipeg's lineup, but maybe need to take a step forward before we start thinking about that next level for them. Not that they are not going to make it necessarily, but perhaps they haven't yet shown enough consistently to be super excited. But, you know, every season is a new season, and development is not always linear. There's plenty of guys who take a little bit more of a circuitous route. Maybe this is the season that some of them really start to break through. So we'll chat about that later this episode, because I think we actually have quite a few candidates, particularly with the Moose, that I'm very curious about. But before we dive into getting excited about camp, which is upcoming, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Now, like I said, camp officially, per the Jets account, is coming. We all knew that, though. I mean, it's August. We're getting closer to fall. We talked about yesterday the fact that the Jets actually have quite a few things to take care of before the start of the season. But, you know, Winnipeg, I think they're starting to have some guys maybe come back from vacation. And this is actually, for me, a pretty exciting time. It's not often where I'm looking forward to the start of the season, but the last couple of years, I guess I've been more anticipatory than usual. I feel like I've just been ready for Jets hockey again, which is kind of funny because the prior seasons when Maurice was still coaching, we sort of knew what we were getting into, and I think there was a sense of overall franchise fatigue. There was definitely some frustration, and I think a lot of us were getting tired of it, but I'm just glad that the Jets are starting to finally, come back into session, and they're getting ready for what should be a good season. But there has been some sentiment that I think folks are not super thrilled. I saw something earlier about the Jets perhaps not being interested in spending quite to the cap this year, which would be interesting. I mean, if they want to shave off a few dollars and keep things a little bit more on track because there's an expectation that this year's team is just not going to be as good. I can see that. I could see that they don't want to spend all their cash and resources on a season where they feel it's going to be a growing year. And I think that's kind of why they may be setting us up for that. Again, this quote, maybe it was taken out of context. I've heard something like Winnipeg saying they want to be somewhere around like the middle of the pack in terms of cap expenditures, which, I mean, they're still spending a decent amount, don't get me wrong, but they just don't want to max things out. And I don't hate that if the idea is that this year is perhaps a wait and see approach, right? See how the kids adapt and then kind of go from there. If you want to start looking for maybe some big acquisitions towards the trade deadline, something of that nature. And it's maybe why they try to not be too spendy at free agency. Aside from some of their targets like Sean Monahan and a few others, maybe they were less interested in really locking up a ton of money in players who, quite frankly, didn't fit their timeline. So with that in mind, the fall training camp and stuff is going to be a really big deal as the Jets start to get back into session and get back up to speed. this is where I think the hype starts to build. Winnipeg is really talking this year about using the youth, relying on the kids. And for me, I think that's the direction that they should have been doing for years, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that, at this point, um, I have a clear sense of what this team is going to be like this season, but I'm excited to find out. New coaching staff, folks who have seemingly been pushing some directions that I've personally been arguing in favor of for years now. And look, it is a little bit belated, but at this point, I'll take whatever I can get. If the Jets want to start really investing in data science to help them figure out some roster stuff, to push the organization in a better direction going forward, that's cool with me. I think it's especially important for a team like Winnipeg because, as people have talked about in the comments, the Jets aren't the most attractive destination for a lot of free agents and big trade targets, right? You have to have something to convince people, or you also have to look at maybe some market inefficiencies. Maybe you can lure some players who are being overlooked because, for one reason or another, they're just not getting the same attention from some top clubs. And I think the Jets can take advantage of that. I think that's where Winnipeg could really make some bread and butter. I don't expect them to always use this necessarily, not in at least the immediate future, but I think over the next few seasons, we might see them start to leverage more information and more database decisions to try and find some areas where they can maybe add a little bit more to the depth and stuff like that. That's kind of why I like that Hayden Fleury and Dylan Coghlan little bet, if you can call it that, something like that. We'll actually talk a little bit about whether or not those guys are going to be surprise standouts, because I think people are going to be surprised at how good they are as professional players. And I think the Moose are especially going to love that, they're going to have a couple of guys who can step in and be big presences on the back line. So some real exciting stuff there. I'm feeling pretty good about this upcoming year. I have sort of already prepared myself for the potential that the season doesn't necessarily lead to a big playoff run, but I mean, if it does happen, that's great, right? But I also am sort of the mindset that the most important thing this year is getting your process right. I know in previous years I really talked about the 2-year or 3-year competitive window. I'm sort of tabling that for now because I think the Jets themselves have sort of pushed it a little bit back. Winnipeg going through the youth movement this year and really emphasizing that in this offseason, for me, suggests that they're trying to prime a more, I would say, ambitious competitive push in the year after and probably the following season. So with Hellebuyck and Scheifele signed, it certainly extends your window perhaps longer than the initial suspicion was, right? Although, with Ehlers potentially expiring, Connor coming up for renewal in a couple of years, guys like that who are core parts of the team, obviously there is some urgency to figure out what the longer term plan is there. But in terms of integrating the kids and stuff, Winnipeg is seemingly getting the jump on that now, which is good because they're going to be needed over the next few seasons. And, I'm just interested to see how things play out in camp. I would love to start to see some early Jets lines and where they envision maybe Cole Perfetti, Brad Lambert, guys like that in the lineup. I feel pretty strongly Shibrikov is going to be somewhere in the bottom 6. So with him, there's a degree of certainty. With Lambert, though, he, for me, has a lot more to figure out in terms of where his best role is. I know some people are sort of against the idea of him as a winger, and I think that there is an argument that he has primarily played better at center, but of course, NHL center versus AHL center, bit of a different story. So I don't want to rush him into things, but Winnipeg also kind of will need him to adapt to the NHL probably sooner rather than later. So when do you start to push him into a prime role? I'm sure that'll be a conversation as we get into the season. But for camp, I guess there are some questions as to who might be a surprise standout, whether it's camp or even preseason. I'll chat about a few of the guys that I'm kind of personally keeping an eye on, maybe a couple of new attendees, or at least for Winnipeg's perspective, maybe some names that we're relatively familiar with. We'll chat about that in just a little bit. But before we go too much further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed. We're all driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. For those of you who understand how to build championship teams, which Obviously, that's a bit of a complex thing. You have to carefully scout, you have to curate your roster and do all this. And when it comes to hiring, it's actually not that dissimilar, right? You're looking to find the best quality candidates, and sometimes it can be really hard to get matched to folks who really fit your business. But that's why Indeed wants to take out all the busy work. They do all the stuff from scheduling to screening and messaging, helping you to optimize your business operations and find quality candidates fast. And best of all, you're actually hiring quality candidates much faster than other job sites. For those of you who have ever used Indeed, myself included, you know that if you were searching for work, it's great. It's super detailed. You put in all this information and data that Indeed uses to actually give you a relevant listing of job openings. I found stuff that was legit, perfectly up my alley. I even applied to stuff using Indeed, and I thought it was great. And 3.5 million businesses worldwide already use Indeed to host their job listings. So why don't you give it a try? There's a special little offer for those of you who are listeners of this podcast. You will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on Locked On Winnipeg Jets. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode as we are just chatting about, upcoming off-season stuff, more heading into the actual season itself. Training camp is coming up. Preseason won't be long after. It's about dang time. For the first time in a while, I've really been missing Jets hockey, I guess. Maybe it's the Olympic spirit. Maybe it's the fact that we had a really piss poor playoff performance that sort of left a feeling of unfinished business. And now we have a new coaching staff. So, all told, there's a lot to kind of be curious about, especially with the influx of youth that is seemingly driving this upcoming season. So, hey, there's a lot of room for growth. I'm excited for it. Slightly nervous about a couple of things, but you know what? It is what it is. I've already sort of talked about how I'm preparing myself to perhaps not expect playoffs this year, but only time will tell how the Jets will handle that. I want to talk about some potential camp standouts, guys who I'm kind of going to be keeping an eye on either through training camp or through preseason. There's a few players that I'm sort of interested in as to whether or not they might make an impact enough to fight for an NHL roster spot. But before we talk about those folks, just wanted to let you know, for those of you who have made us your first listen of the day every day, also recommend that you make your second listen the Locked On NHL podcast. Locked On NHL provides you with a national perspective on all things NHL each and every day, with national experts and local insight on every team in the league. Available on YouTube or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. It's also part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, like I said, camp is going to be a fun time, I think, for a lot of us. We have a couple of new additions, more so on the defensive side than on the forward side. Dylan Coghlan and, of course, Hayden Fleury are both joining. And, you've got a couple of really big skaters with some intriguing traits. Hayden, in particular, is a really big kid. I call him a kid, but he's really not. He's, mid-20s at this point. And Coghlan had a really nice stint with the Golden Knights for a year or so, and then hasn't really, landed an NHL role recently. But what I'm kind of hoping with either of them is that they really prove to be good enough to fight for the 7th spot. I think, after the Jets move on from Logan Stanley, there's going to be an opening there for the number 7 role, and perhaps even a third pairing role once Colin Miller's deal is up. And if Fleury or Coghlan can prove that they are the guys, I certainly wouldn't hate that. The Jets do also have some players in the system like Garrett Brown. We're keeping an eye on him. From what I've heard from his college stuff, he's been pretty decent. So, Denver University, his first couple of games looked pretty nice. His USHL numbers were pretty decent. Now it's kind of getting him a full season of college hockey, starting to see what he's capable of at a higher level. He's 20. He's relatively exciting. I think he's got some interesting passing traits and stuff, but he's a little more distant, right? And so until that point, you're probably hoping that one of these guys that you've maybe taken a really cheap gamble on steps up in a big way this year. And I'm going to be keeping an eye on them throughout camp and training and preseason, just to see if they've maybe got a little bit extra in the tank. I think both are going to be motivated to fight for an NHL spot. I'm sure both are aware that they are likely not really getting much in the way of full-time deployments this year. That's why we're seeing some two-way deals there. But either way, whether they're playing for the Moose or the Jets, I thought that they were really smart gambles. They're the kind of contracts that I mentioned on the last episode that I wish the Jets had maybe done a few more of in trying to find some value around the margins to round out your organization. I think they both made sense. They might actually both be better than Logan Stanley already. So for that reason, I think that they were smart ads already. And if nothing else, they'll really help out Manitoba's back end, because the Moose have had some issues over the last couple of seasons with the in and out of some quality AHLers. And this year, they're going to have a really big offensive loss with the Moose likely promoting both Shipperkov and Lambert. That's going to be really tough for them to stomach. So having some back-end help will certainly not be undue. Now, another guy from Manitoba that I'm kind of interested in seeing what he does in camp is Parker Ford. Ford really impressed last season and preseason. I thought he looked like an NHLer. Obviously, his game is relatively straightforward. I think he projects as like a really solid third or fourth liner, maybe in sort of that Appleton tier if everything went right. I know folks have had their own issues with Appleton's game, but at the same time, he does still do his job relatively well. And I think that there is a role for him on the fourth line. And if you get something like that out of Parker Ford, that's fantastic. You've got a youngish 24-year-old prime-aged forward with some positional versatility. Technically, he has been listed as playing a center. Generally speaking, I think he tends to play out wide, but I'll be curious to know what he does in camp this year. I think he'll have another preseason shot. The Jets aren't necessarily looking for more bottom six players at this point. I think Winnipeg is primarily trying to figure out the top nine, but not to say that there isn't potential for them to look at some guys for call-ups. And Ford, like I said, looked really good in preseason. So, if he does actually end up having a successful year, I wouldn't put it past the Jets to maybe give him a call-up in case of some sort of injury or something. Again, he was basically found money when he left Providence, and I think these are the kinds of cool little signings that you can bring in, and sometimes one of them becomes a good NHLer. I think back to Brandon Tanev when he first arrived from the Jets. He was much more raw when he came in. He was just bad, to be honest. And then over the course of several seasons, started to become a surprisingly versatile defensive utility player. Obviously, the offensive side of his game was a little limited, but all that said, he did some defensive stuff really well, and I'm hoping Ford kind of brings a little bit more of an offensive bent. Last season, 41 points with the Moose in 72 games, one of their top scorers. I'm kind of interested to see what he does and what this growth in his game is going to lead to. Not that I'm expecting much in terms of top six talent or anything. I think that is absolutely not where I'm envisioning him, but some level of growth in his game would be nice, I would say, to start to see him potentially fight for an NHL role down the road. Last guy that I'm going to be watching, not necessarily as like a big breakout kind of player, but somebody who could do some stuff to impress, is Rasmus Kupari. Kupari is a really interesting one because I feel like his game is missing something essential. I don't know what it is, whether it's decision-making or awareness. He has tons of physical traits and tools and skill and skating, but then it just never really coalesces into something that has wowed me. It's the same problem that I had with Gustafsson until the past year or so. Gus, I love him. I've always talked about him as being a really fun player, but he also has some moments where it's kind of like something is missing with that extra level of skill with him. Although I think he has really started to figure it out at the NHL level. And I think if you play him with skill, things are going to go well. Kupari, I haven't necessarily seen that as much. I continue to feel like, he is Winnipeg's 13th forward right now. As an injury replacement, it's fine. But I think that I really need to see him have a strong camp in preseason and show that he's willing to grow his game. I can kind of see why LA sort of tossed him in. He hasn't really found his footing at this level yet, but that's not to say that he still can't. So we'll see what he does in camp. If he does really start to hit his stride, again, he is one of the best skaters that we have. I think he's super fast. He's He's definitely one of those straight line kind of players who can fly up the ice, better than most. And so it's really a question of, okay, so what's he going to do with that speed? How is he going to leverage it? And I think that is what I want to see him really work on this upcoming season. And hopefully at some point he starts to put it all together, because if he does, and if he really starts to add that extra layer, of NHL decision-making and timing, he could be a real sleeper pick to have a surprisingly impressive season. Again, I don't know that I'm expecting a lot, but for Emil this year, it is what it is. We'll see what he can do. I'm just hoping that he kind of adds a little bit extra layer to his skill level. But kind of on a related note, I also am keeping an eye on some Moose-bound players. These are guys who are likely to spend most of the year down there, if nothing else, because Manitoba is a bit of a talent wasteland right now and needs help, and also because there's a couple of guys here. One in particular, I'm keeping an eye on that maybe has had some delays in their season, and or in their development, and maybe needs a full pro season to start to get up to speed. We'll get to that in just a little bit. But before we go any further, again, just kind of wanted to bring it back to our friends and partners at Game Time. When it comes to buying tickets, a lot of you know how it's a bit of a pain in the butt. I have gone to plenty of Orioles games over the summer, and look, I enjoy going out to the park, but sometimes buying tickets is just not that fun, right? You get hit with surprise charges and fees, and especially if you're buying from a third-party service, you can end up paying a lot more than you expect. That's why Game Time is here to help. They offer you killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, which is great so you can find out if it's actually obstructed, and their lowest price guarantee. They also come backed with event cancellation protection and more, which for a lot of you, I'm sure if you're not really prepared for the unexpected, that can be a super helpful guarantee to have on hand. Game Time has also become an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So if you like saving money, this is a great way to do it. They also come with flash deals and zone deals, so you can find some exclusive deals on certain sections and seats that help you save even more cash. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for joining us on tonight's episode, as we are just closing out really quickly with some final thoughts on players that I'm personally keeping an eye on and wanting to track this year with the Moose. Obviously, I won't have a ton of time to watch the Moose game specifically, thanks to the fact that following every Jets game tends to take some time. So we'll see how much I'm able to watch this year. But in terms of Moose players that I'm particularly interested in, the first one that really comes to mind is Chaz Lucius. Lucius is obviously one of those guys who just has like the worst possible luck imaginable. I feel so bad for him because his entire trajectory and career arc has been completely derailed by constant serious injuries. He's had to have I think at least one or two surgeries, and look, technically the thing with him is that they're all for the most part in different parts of his body, but they're all serious. And like by the age of 21, having had 2 or 3 season-ending injuries already, it's a little grim. I won't lie, it's rough. And the thing that really is unfortunate, aside from just a personal level, you really root for him to feel better, is when he's actually healthy and playing, the kid has, he is an undeniable, like, blue chip kind of prospect. I don't know what his ceiling is these days, but just look at some of the early numbers, right? Last year with the Moose in his 17 games, 13 points. And then when he went to Portland the year before, 15 points in 6 games. You could tell that he was legit ready to make a statement. His early college stay for that one season with Minnesota was kind of like, but we already knew that Lucius had some really intriguing talent from having seen him come into Jets preseason and camp. And I'm just all I'm hoping for him is just to stay healthy this year. He's only 21. He's a super bright and talented prospect. We were all hailing him at one point as like the next Kyle Connor. And look, defensive stuff aside, having like a phenomenal goal scorer and creator and finisher the way that Lucius can is really nothing to sniff at, especially when you develop it internally. He's one of our first round picks that I'm really still holding out for. I don't want to say that his pro hockey career is over. In fact, I think if anything, you should be heartened to having seen Gabriel Velarde continue to be an everyday player for the most part. Because I think that's what Lucius could do too. If he can find a way to just make it through the season with, out having like some horrendous fortune, which, not always in his control, I think that would be such a tremendous boost for him and also for his potential to reach the Jets. He's like the sleeper prospect that I think a lot of people have sort of overlooked because, you recall Luke Green a few years ago had a similar issue where he just kept getting hurt and like it basically forced him out of the major leagues in pro hockey. And I think he's actually a coach now somewhere from what I recall, doing some like instructional lessons with kids. It's a shame because like I really thought he could have been such a great player for Winnipeg, but it just never really worked out with how much his body just continued to break down. So I'm really hoping that we see Lucius really stay healthy. The other guy that I'm kind of curious about is Daniel Torgerson. Torgerson, I mean, with him, like there's definitely a player there. I just haven't really seen a lot from him that suggests he's going to end up being more than like a fourth liner. And even at that level, I feel like I've generally seen him as a Moose player. I know he's never exactly been like a super, super prolific scorer, but I feel like I thought he was going to have more to offer at the Moose level. Last year's Moose season, though, was relatively anemic. I know he also, I think, had some like injury stuff on and off, but I think the biggest thing is like, for a skater his size, who's relatively strong in transition and protects the puck well, I'd like to see him do more with it. I think he really needs a really successful Moose season to kind of stay in Winnipeg's radar. So far, it's not really been there, but it's not to say that he can't pull it kind of back and get back into Winnipeg's, I think, interest. Obviously, look, he was like a later second round pick, so it's not a big deal if he mostly just plays as a Moose guy. But with his rare physical traits and things, I really want to see him take a step forward. He's only 22. He's still got time to develop and turn into something interesting. I think this year kind of has to be a bit of a make or break for him, or he'll start to push further and further back in Winnipeg's depth chart. Last guy, I think we've previously covered on another episode, sort of like Lucius, but Danny Zilkin, I think is a guy who, hoping he has a full season, stays healthy. I've always kind of viewed him as a really fun utility player, and I think that's really where he'll start to make his bread and butter. He did play a fair chunk of Moose games last year. I think he talked about it being a bit of a challenge, and the first pro season didn't quite go, I think, as smoothly as he would have liked. This year, though, having had that experience, a bit more physical maturity and development, and hopefully, a healthier season, I'm hoping that he has a big year and that he really starts to push to make the Jets in the coming seasons. He's got a great personality. He's a great, relentless sort of player who has a really good jack of all trades approach. He's strong in transition. He's got some, defensive smarts. A pretty solid release, good passing and vision and spatial awareness. Just a really well-rounded prospect. And again, super likable. You're easily rooting for him. I think he does his own charity work and stuff. And, his partner, he works with a lot. They do all this charity stuff. And so it's just seems like a great guy, a great character person, a great player, and hopefully, at some point, maybe even earns a leadership role with the Jets if everything pans out down the road. But like I said, the first step for him is having a healthy, successful Moose season. He's got plenty of time to really start to round out his game at the pro level, and I'm hoping that this year is, a big one for him. He might even have a really strong preseason and training camp, which I think would be great for him. Just give him that confidence to go back to the Moose this year and have a big season. So lots of interesting prospects kind of sitting in these peripheries. I think Winnipeg fans tend to look at guys like Lambert and Chibrikov and Barlow as the big three. Salamonson should actually be in that group as well. But I think there's a lot of other guys who are going to start fighting for roles here over the years. I'm thinking, Jacob Julian, Kevin He, guys like that. I'm excited to see what they become. So let's hope that at least some of these guys can make the league and actually have an impact at the NHL level. Let me know which prospects you're going to be monitoring this year. Who are you interested in? Who are you sort of maybe not as impressed with? Drop your comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. We'll see you back here again for one more episode this week. And as always, have a great night and go Jets go.